This has really been a great experience working with you all. Our team is very rigorous about who we collaborate with. When we collaborate a lot, we really vet those to make sure it's folks who play well with others. And so I kind of wandered into your group, and I feel fortunate that you all play well with others. So that's good relational stuff. So here's the plan for today. Let me just highlight a couple resources. I know some of you are looking for resources, so mention a couple things that I kind of glossed over yesterday. There is, in the slides I sent out yesterday, information about Chrysalis. I know some of you have already looked into that if you want to look into the possibility of enrolling, or if you know people who would like to. We have this conference coming up on November 1st, Beyond Self-Care, Holistic Approaches to Preventing Burnout and Promoting Flourishing. That's going to be a free online conference, again through the Peel Grant. I will probably plan to put all of your emails, if that's okay, onto our mailing about this, but if you want to be off that, let me know.
And we could be in person?
Yeah, you could come, if you want to come in person, It's going to be mostly online. Right. Yeah, we found the reach with the online. We have people internationally, folks who wouldn't be able to, who don't have grant funds to travel to Boston, so it's been great to do these free conferences. But yeah, if you want to come and be in person. Also, I'm working with the Association of Theological Schools, that's the main accrediting body of seminaries, on a trauma and spirituality initiative. It's coming out of their Office of Race and Ethnicity, so their diversity initiatives, quite concerned about attention to trauma and how we can do spiritual formation that would attend to trauma with a strong diversity and justice emphasis. So I just wanted to mention a few resources. They're putting on a conference that I'm helping plan at Fuller Seminary in November. There's information on the website about that. We also made a couple of free webinars that are on their website, and it's developed a bit of a following among people that are preparing leaders and concerned about these issues and bringing them into the preparation of leaders. Our Danielson website has a bunch more information about our work and has a number of free videos that could be of interest, including our conference from 2022, Therapy and Spiritual Care in a Shattered World. We actually video recorded this conference, and it's available for free if you want to tune into some of that content, again, from the Peel Grant, which has been great for that kind of stuff. Okay. So, look, you can tell my style, ambitious agenda for today, but let's go and linger what seems most relevant to you. Also, we're doing a lot of what we could call in intercultural terms code switching. We're moving between theology, psychology, various languages. Again, please speak up. I don't know what that term means, or help me understand that a bit more. Let's not gloss over stuff. I got a great question from Jessica last night, which is, what is your take-home point for us? I said, I don't know, but I'll think about it. And I think this is, so I'll give you the take-home, and then we'll kind of lean into this today. I think for me, the take-home is that really authentic, healthy relational development, which is not microwavable, but it is possible if we're really intentional and wise about how we set that up, is crucial to bringing together the triangle of spiritual formation, mental health, and what we could call intercultural competence. That holy triangle, all of those, spiritual formation, spiritual maturity in the Christian tradition, as well as many other traditions, mental health, intercultural competence, all rest on healthy relational development. And what do I mean by that? I mean really developmental constructs like secure attachment. If you haven't studied attachment, I would highly recommend that. Differentiation of self, we referred to that a bit yesterday, and I'll come back to it. That's a great start. You could develop robust programs for leaders, for other folks you're ministering to that integrate the best of spirituality with attachment and differentiation and keep it on a nice diversity and justice edge. And that's my take home. I don't think there's a way, as I've tried to say a couple times, I don't think there's a way of cheating that process. It's crucial to have practices that help us grow, practices rest on relational, emotional, and spiritual development. We have studies of folks who engage in practices out of a traumatized relational template about God, and they feel worse. They feel worse. So, practices are important. We've got to do practices, but we've also got to be really wise and thoughtful about how to cultivate. I think it's cultivating the soil for growth that is healthy relational development. And that means not cutting corners we'll talk about some of that today when we have leaders or congregants or folks who really need work in that area. And we need to be intentional about trying to guide people towards that work and staying active in doing it ourselves. So I was going to say, I could take a couple questions before we launch into the topic. I know you all got to be excited about narcissism and humility. That gets hardly any better than that. That's like one of my favorite topical sets, so I'm excited. But let's take a couple questions. Yeah.
Do you have any resources that people can use in congregations for spiritual development or intercultural competency?
Yeah, if you want to send an email, I can recommend some particular things. I'll try and get to that today. Tricia was just asking me about some of that. And so, yeah, a lot of the stuff I'm giving you is sort of the high-level research and theory, but I know you got to translate it down. Any other lingering questions from yesterday that would be helpful to clarify? Yeah.
You mentioned yesterday, I don't remember exactly who put it, but how spouses of ministry leaders also experience, trauma from.
Yeah.
Is there more? Do you have more to say about that? We have a lot of several people that are married on our staff, or elders, or just involved in a lot of just this last year's been real messy.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, our pastors need care, but then it's like, actually, the spouses do too.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just was curious if you had more to say about that, or if there's more research about that.
I could, yeah, that's a great question. I could say a lot because I do mostly couple therapy, and that's probably what I'm best at. I think if I ask what am I really best at, it's probably that. Yeah, a couple of key points. I mean, it's really important for folks in ministry who have a partner or spouse to understand there's going to be a flow of that stress or traumatic impact. And really what the research shows, I glossed through that pretty fast, but is that there's really bi-directional influences. What happens in our family often can flow towards our work. What happens in our work can flow towards our family, and that really requires a lot of intentional differentiation of self would be the fancy term, for us to be thoughtful, reflective, intentional, learning to practice boundaries. My wife's a clinical social worker in an urban children's hospital that is very high stress. It's a higher stress job than what I do. And as just one example, we try to be really intentional about if we were going to talk about something related to work stress, we ask consent. Like a little, hey, I got something that'd really be helpful for me to process about work. How are you doing? And not to just blow into it, because if you get too much of that free-flowing, I don't know where the other person's at, you're letting work intrude. Now, I think it can be to have a partner who's got the relational capacities to be helpful for metabolizing, especially because it is going to make its way in. I don't think that there has to be a rigid, but every couple has to figure out their rhythms, their boundary practices, and to have some times of saying, now to tell you the truth, this isn't a great time. Can we come back to it? And so I think people need to be given scaffolding about even those things that for some people could seem obvious, and to be thoughtful about the influences intergenerationally that affect how we come at that stuff. I've had a lot of clergy couples who the partner in ministry was not that insightful about how it was impacting their partner. That's kind of the traditional male-dominated pastor, wife comes along for the ride, and that sort of a system that hopefully we're moving away from. But in that traditional role, the partner is along for the ride whether they want to be or not. They're expected to be helpful to the ministry even if they're not remunerated. And I've seen all kinds of versions of that couple system. I do couples intensive sometimes where I see a couple for 3 hours a day for 3 days in a row, which is kind of, I think of it like as a revival weekend. It's pretty intense. And I had a pastor, I was moving a little too fast. This reflects the narcissism topic. I was moving a little too fast for him. And his spouse was pissed about all of this stuff I just described. And she was not going to church anymore. And in their little rural church, that was a big deal. And he was humiliated that she wasn't going, but he wasn't doing a good job of dialoguing about any of that, right? I was moving a little too fast on day one. He threw a pen, he was taking notes, he threw a pen like a dart off my chest.
Whoa.
Isn't that amazing? That's called a trauma fight response. My chest was a dartboard for him to let me know I was moving too fast. I did get the point. Did I ease off the gas? Somewhat, yeah. Yeah. And that's a good point about trauma, that when you get out ahead of people, I've had clients, he's the only one I think who's literally thrown an object at me. But I've had a couple of other clients who've picked up something because that's, trauma stuff that's getting activated, and, it's necessary to slow down and ease off the gas. But actually, that's important information to know that I'm probably going down the right path. It's just activating those kinds of defensive responses. But to your question, that was like a couple that their marriage was totally on the line over the inability to work that sort of stuff out, right? And there's various other versions of that. I had an intent, so warning, this one's a little explicit. So I had a conversation with a couple at one point. I remember that he was a pastor, heterosexual couple again. And I remember getting down a line of conversation where I needed to ask her, when you're having sex, are you having sex with your husband or with your pastor? Now that reflects some of the boundary diffusion and complication. It was actually a really helpful question. She said, I don't know. Right. But that, you see what I mean? That is sort of the enmeshment, the role confusion that you need to sort out through differentiation. And that was a really important conversation for that particular couple. So it can take a lot of different forms. There's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. So, okay. Humility in an age of narcissism. Let me open with this text and question. Let you look at that for a minute and reflect on it. What does it mean that God is humble? I'm going to come back to that, but let's let that percolate. Now, are we living in an age of narcissism? As a social scientist, I tend to want to be really responsible about this. So I can't claim to tell you that we definitively in 2024 have rising rates of narcissism in the United States. But let me show you some of the pointers that raise the question. This was a book called The Narcissism Epidemic back in 2008 that chronicled freshman college student scores on narcissism from about the 1980s to 2005. Showing an upward trend, June Twenge made a lot out of this, that there seemed to be rising rates of narcissism among young people. Got a lot of attention. There's also been some longitudinal studies from around that same time period, a little more recent, showing declining levels of empathy and rising levels of avoidant attachment. Now, these are sort of indirect markers, but large-scale longitudinal studies, again, mostly of college students, so that doesn't cover the whole population. But some markers that it seems like there's been a move towards less empathy towards others, which can be a symptom, and a kind of closed-off, hyper-independent, invulnerable relational stance, which is what avoidant attachment is, which is also sort of an indirect indicator. This fun study by Jason Miller was a bunch of countries around the world, I can't remember, 15 different countries or something, asking about rating people from different countries in their level of narcissism. And guess what? We won. United States won. We're perceived as the most narcissistic country, right? So whether we are or not is maybe open to debate, but people think we are. And even Americans think that we are, but other people are more narcissistic than us, which is the way the data went, right? Which is kind of narcissistic, right? Other people, my goodness, people in America are narcissistic, but I'm not, that's, right? So, fun story from my clinical internship in a federal prison. I was about 28 years old. I was working full-time in a federal prison, forensic unit, and doing clinical services. And there was an inmate who asked to be seen by a psychologist. He was probably about my age, mid-50s. And you pull up their records before they come in. He was an Ivy League trained lawyer who was in federal prison for a ton of drunk driving offenses. I was kind of shocked you can make it into federal prison for that. So, the first session, he comes in, sits down, and here's the opening. I think I hadn't even sat down yet. He says, Mr. Sandage, it is Mr. Sandage, right? As I understand it, you're not done with your doctorate yet. So once you finish that, I'd be glad to refer to you as Dr. Sandage. But until then, I'll just go with Mr. Sandage. I haven't even said anything yet. But I said, I'll refer to you as narcissistic personality disorder. That's what I had in my head. I actually didn't say that. Fascinating encounter. Now, over the years, I've worked clinically with a lot of folks who are high in the narcissism range. I see narcissism as a continuum. I'll unpack that. But especially among men and folks that have this kind of grandiose or bully form of narcissism, it's amazing how often they want to get a punch in before you even get your bearings, and especially when they're in a vulnerable situation. Now, you can imagine for a 28-year-old feeling kind of insecure in this setting, right? He definitely had me on my heels. But when I thought about it later, I thought, how humiliating is it for an Ivy League trained lawyer to be in federal prison in that situation, wanting to get some mental health help, and he's assigned an intern half his age, right? That's the context in which he delivers. He didn't throw a pen at me. He did a verbal equivalent to try to bring me down a notch. Now, here's the thing about that sort of narcissism when it's dysfunctional like that. In some ways, that doesn't really make sense to be trying to get help from somebody and to try to sort of demean them as you're trying to get help, right? If you were trying to work out a business contract or something like that, but it is kind of interesting the way some pathological narcissism is sort of inflexible in its overuse or cross-situational of I'm going to do the same thing to people regardless of whether it makes sense in that context or not. Now, before I go on, other reflections on that, because I'm guessing I'm not the only person in the room who's had that kind of an encounter with somebody. Danielle?
So you just differentiated, or you specifically said that that's a bully form of narcissism.
Yeah, that expression is, yeah, I think there are definitely bully
Okay,
forms.
are there different forms? Are you
Yeah.
talking
I am going to talk about that. Yep. There's a couple different forms I'll go through.
I'm always curious about, I don't know if you're going to talk about this, we talk about varying mental health disorders in these really pejorative kind of terms, and then years later, we talk about, like, okay, it's not all bad, like, here's some things, and narcissism is the one I have never seen any kind of, like, well, here's what's good about it.
You're in the right place.
Okay.
You want to say more about that?
No, I'm just curious if there is, and also, like, my understanding is, I don't know that if a true narcissist can truly, like, heal, or I don't even know the right language, so I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. So if we think of narcissism, I should have sent this to all of you today, so if you didn't get it in your email, those slides, let me know. As long a continuum, and that there's both healthy and pathological expressions of it. So those are the main points. This is a really detailed diagram that some folks came up with if you want to study it. But the main point is that I think it's helpful to think of narcissism as ranging from the very pathological to even having healthy forms, which we'll describe. And I think narcissism does, even though I think there's really things to be very concerned about that are in some cases underrated, I think that there's such a thing as healthy narcissism. That comes from Heinz Kohut, who at his funeral had, he was a Unitarian, Jewish Unitarian. He had the passage from Genesis 1 about dominion over the earth read, which I think reflected his implicit theology that we are created in the image of God to do great things. That's what Kohut believed. So there can be a healthy narcissism in the sense of expansion to do great things. And one of the key points here is going to be a la Kohut or relational spirituality. If we don't develop the relational development to surround that, it's like a nuclear reactor. It is that sort of narcissistic energy can be very destructive. But are there healthy and adaptive aspects of narcissism that might even really be necessary for leadership? Let's mull that over for a moment. Maybe this example won't work for everybody, but you could ask, was like Michael Jordan narcissistic? 100%? Yeah. Is there a confidence, expansiveness among many good leaders that ends up, when it works well, being surrounded by the characterological structures, the containment, the humility to hold that? Other thoughts or pushback about the healthy narcissism idea?
Does healthy equate to normal in this?
Normal's a tough term, because there's so many different cultural contexts and stuff, so I'm not a great fan of normal. But I think constructive, is there a kind of confidence, a willingness to stick one's neck out that is necessary for aspects of life and leadership? This comes easier for those of us who are socially privileged, like I am as a white male. It's harder, I think, for women and persons of color to develop that ability to feel confident in putting oneself out there in social environments that tend to punish that, right? So that's one of the other contextual pieces here. Who finds it easy to develop healthy narcissism, especially if we see a lot of examples of white males succeeding or having a voice or having power, then I grow up in an environment where I've seen all kinds of examples of that. That isn't true for everybody, right? So my colleague Phyllis Shepard writes about the need for cultural supports for healthy self-development for women and persons of color, queer folks, because there just are so few of those in the wider environment, right? So we don't all come to this from the same place. But I think there's something about a dialectic of humility and confidence, if you're more comfortable with confidence is the term. I like healthy narcissism because it's a little edgy, but go ahead.
Sorry, you answered.
No.
I'm still struggling with Michael Jordan and narcissism because just to being good and you know it. But you just answered what I was thinking.
Well, what do you think? Unpack that.
Just confidence would be maybe a parallel term, but if you're just simply good and you know it, as opposed to.
Yeah, that's because if it's realistic, right? Right. There's a realistic strength. And even Jordan had his own trajectory of needing to learn to collaborate with others rather than try to do it all himself, right? So there was some tempering of his kind of competitive narcissism. And at times it sounds like it might have been violent, which is probably going over the line, right? Other comments in this? So I think it's helpful to think of narcissism as involving challenges or problems of self-esteem regulation. When it's pathological, it's really problematic self-esteem regulation. But we're all up against needing to figure out how to regulate our self-esteem in the face of sources of invalidation, critical feedback about the sermon you gave, right? The policy change, as well as the kind of interesting pressure when people are idealizing. I think an underrated challenge when people are giving lots of validation and it's sort of cotton candy, it's kind of not real substantive. That is part of the self-regulation challenge, self-esteem regulation challenge of narcissism. Now, the research today, large body research, shows there's really kind of two main forms to your question, Danielle, grandiose and vulnerable. And both showed correlations with trauma symptoms in that clergy study I showed you. So we don't know the direction of that influence. Does trauma mess with our self-esteem regulation? Or could folks who have some vulnerability that way be more susceptible? We can't quite sort that out, but there's some connection. So we'll go through these. The main diagnostic system about narcissistic personality disorder, it's better to think of narcissism as on a continuum. It's like a personality trait that's on a continuum. The personality disorder version is an extreme of that, where someone has a high loading of narcissism that's chronic, that's cross-situational, and that's leading to problems. Now, it's interesting. Folks with high levels of narcissism in the US context, which I think tends to reinforce a lot of that, can often get away with those tendencies and have a fair amount of success, especially if there's a lot of privilege that they have, because they can continue to sort of succeed and not get in trouble. But eventually, it usually leads to problems in relationships, marriage, family, if not business or occupationally. And here are the main symptoms really of that really map largely onto grandiose narcissism. Fantasies of self-importance and unlimited success, believes he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or associate with other special or high status people. These would be folks who, like maybe they want to meet with you but not some volunteer in the church, right? They're not, that doesn't do it for them. They feel too important for that. Sense of entitlement, at certain extremes can be exploitive. That's not always high. Lack of empathy, tend to often feel envious of others, arrogant. This is the grandiose style, which when you combine it with someone who's kind of got an aggressive instinct, so to your question, Danielle, bully narcissism is just a term I use. It's not a formal one. For folks who have probably a lot of this grandiose narcissism and an aggressive style. And it feels comfortable to them to put people on their heels, right? That's so they do a fair amount of that. Questions or comments about this?
What is the 5+, does that relate to, like on the previous study, you had one that showed that normal or healthy?
So to get this diagnosis in the diagnostic system in the mental health system, you need 5 or more of these symptoms over a 2-year period for adults.
Over a 2-year period.
So it's chronic. So you can think of it as, like I was trying to say, a kind of inflexible approach to, coping with stuff if someone is high in this. They just keep doing this. It's not even always whether they could get away with it or not, or what the situation calls for. This is how their character is structured. Yeah.
This may be an impossible question, but what types of trauma relate or that contribute to somebody develop? And I'm assuming this is developed. It's like a developed disorder.
There's probably some genetic loading as well. Yeah, I don't think we have great research on that, but probably some genetic loading, and it's developed. Usually from avoidant attachment. Usually, vulnerability is strongly shamed. Independence is reinforced. Empathy is not at a relational premium in the family system growing up. So, and there's been some adaptive move towards, I'm just super confident about myself and it doesn't matter what goes on with other people. So that's...
But it's not real. Is it real confidence though? Or is it just like a posturing? Because I always got the impression, like dealing with these kind of things, it feels, I mean, they might believe it, but if you start to poke at it, is it really confidence?
That's a good question.
Is it really like a or is it a bluster, to protect?
I think there's a couple of different answers to that. I think there's sometimes when it's fairly fragile, and there's other times where it's pretty deeply embedded. So there are times where you can poke pretty hard, and it's forceful, and you're not going to just break through. So other times it is just pretty fragile. But it's kind of if you think about the defensive response for survival, and it is utterly to a serious narcissist, it is utterly shameful or humiliating to be vulnerable. I mean, at an existential level. So it's like that deep. And there isn't much developed ability to reflect on any of that, right? So
vulnerability, the epitome issue that they want to stay away from.
yes, vulnerability, being lower power to others, it feels like death, right? So you don't want to be in that space. And if we're talking about personality disorder, they will not go there until they have to. Will not go there until, again, this is on a continuum, but someone who has serious levels of this will not go there until they have to, meaning their marriage is on the line, they've been fired from their job, their pastorate. There's sometimes got to be a couple of things that are narrowing the window, and they don't have any other option. I had a worship pastor who was sent in to me one time. This is a great example, funny example. His wife was set to leave him. His church was totally tired of his antics and his style. And he's coming in, he's a small business owner, which has been kind of there's an example of like his narcissism ran rampant in starting a new business, building it up, right? Not having to answer to anybody else. That you can see where that kind of confidence worked to a point. But he had a lot of issues, and his wife was ready to leave him, and his church said, you got to go in and get help. He comes in, and he walked in the first session with a big binder like this, notebook binder, of the marriage course he had been teaching at his church. And he sat down on the couch. He didn't insult me. This is a different response. He sat down on the couch, and he opened it up, and he was under the impression that he was going to walk me through the marriage curriculum he'd been teaching at his church. Isn't that amazing? He was there because his pastor and his wife told him, you go see this therapist or you're done at the church. He had a part-time role as the leader of worship. He liked the attention. And his wife was ready to leave him. So he knew what the context was of the appointment. But you see what he was putting as the agenda. I'm here to teach you, right? And so, I mean, I said to him pretty candidly, look, I'm not here to learn about your marriage curriculum. Your own marriage is on the line. So why don't you put the notebook down, and why don't we start to talk about this stuff that's going to greatly impact the rest of your life, right? And he and I fought about that for about 6 months, running conflict like that, just to sort of see if he could settle into what the process was going to be about. Now, there's other people you work with in pastoral care who more easily settle into trying to take in or receive help. But folks like this, you're going to have a battle. Now, I think if it's grandiose narcissism like this, I honestly believe most of the time there's a part of them that wants to submit to a benevolent authority figure. But they will fight you in getting there because they've learned. You know who's a good example? If you ever saw the movie Good Will Hunting, that character, if you watch him with Robin Williams, that's a good example of what I'm talking about. Defiant, I'm not going to trust you, go fuck yourself, right? All because of a fight trauma response. And usually that sort of character finds that the people who might try to intervene will give up, be thrown off by it, right? They won't stay the course. Or they get, I mean, there's a scene in that movie that's really interesting where Robin Williams grabs him by the throat. I regret that because it's actually otherwise such a good look at therapy. But that does show you what that character pulls out of you. You want to grab the person by the throat, right?
You're ruining a really great movie for me.
Sorry. It is a great movie.
It's so good.
It's Boston. I mean,
Yeah, it's so good.
yeah. But it shows you the trauma stuff. We want to either back away, they're too powerful, they're bullying us, hey, I want an easier person to work with, or I want to grab this person by the throat. And I think what's needed is, I didn't get the pen thrown at me because I'm passive. I think it's important to move on in on it. But you got to clarify the dilemmas. So you got to clarify the dilemmas in a rather stark way. Another super bully narcissist who actually had some domestic violence, this gives you a little taste of it. He was, man, I could just tell stories all day. I'm not going to do that. But these folks are so interesting. He ran his own business too. He would negotiate in the early sessions. We'd get to the end of the session and he'd say, "Okay, I'm coming back Thursday at 8 a.m." I'd say, "Jim, I actually don't have an appointment open. Let me get my schedule out." Okay, Wednesday at 10 a.m. That's how he thought you negotiated an appointment, because everybody in his life moved like that, right? Well, I started out with him and his wife, and she was real submissive until she drank a bit. And then she would let him have it. And there was an occasion, I'd been drinking out on a boat, and he pushed her. And that was really serious for a lot of reasons. It was violence, and he had had some bad episodes of that in marriage number 2. This was marriage number 3. So he came in and he was minimizing it. And I was meeting with him alone, because once the violence was there, I wasn't going to meet with the two of them. And this is how the conversation went. I said, he wasn't taking in my suggestions. He needed to seriously focus on this, because it was going to ruin his life. And so this is finally how I addressed him. I said, "Jim, look, it's like this. You don't think this is an issue, But here's what I'm concerned about. It helps to use language like I'm concerned. Here's what I'm concerned about. I'm afraid that there's going to be some night you're out on the boat again with her. And maybe she's had a little too much to drink, or maybe you have. And this happens again. And you know what? I really worry that the police are going to get called. And it's going to be some officer who's had a bad day. And he's going to come in and he's going to kick the shit out of you. I just let that hang. Now, it's not fun to do that kind of work because you're appealing to the most base survival instincts of the narcissist, right? It's almost offensive, right? Because there isn't empathy for the impact. There's not a set of relational virtues or values. Jim told me, I don't think so. And he left, and I didn't hear from him for about 3 weeks. And then he called me after about 3 weeks. We didn't have an appointment on the books. And he calls me, and he said, we're out on the boat, and it got close, and I thought about what you said. Then he came in and he worked on this, and we had to rigorously work on basic emotion regulation, empathy skills. I told him we're not working on anything else. That's just all we're doing one-on-one until you get to a point that is going to be able to be workable for your life and for your marriage, right? But that gives you a little feel for what it takes with someone with that high level, right? And a lot of people will just stay out of the way or not take it on. Yeah.
I wonder about like family systems and family structures. And I've heard that like there can be like narc-nests, or like when there's a caregiver or someone in the family who's a narcissist, then there's a likelihood that like other people in the family will become narcissists, or they'll be like highly sensitive and empathetic as a response.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
just wondering like what's your take on. So I just only like briefly kind of.
Yeah, this stuff doesn't, I like, and part of the reason I like to talk to, I think you need to diagnose narcissism. I've got colleagues who would disagree with me. They think it's too pathologized a label. I think that you need to talk about it. I view it as like alcoholism or something. There's no reason to have shame about it. It's a problem. And we have a lot of attention on something like alcoholism. We don't have as much attention on something like this. And I will tell someone, like when I was talking to Jim, I'd say, you come by this honestly. This is narcissism. Let me unpack what that is, but you come by this honestly. So I sort of humanize it in the sense that I think it's not all bad, and people come by it honestly, and it also can be amazingly destructive and insidious, hard to identify. Some of you've probably been in churches that have narcissistic folks who are causing a lot of damage, and people can't quite put their finger on what it is exactly because they're not drunk, they're not using drugs, they're not depressed. What is that, So it's insidious. I think we should talk about it, humanize it, and have rigorous accountability. So when people have been socialized in that kind of a family, it's very hard for them to give up on it, right? So, and it's hard for real serious narcissists, unless they have a spouse who's saying, I'm out of here unless you do something, unless they've lost a job. I mean, what's the crucible that forces the change? You get someone with more mid-level narcissism, or the levels that probably some of us in the room have, let's humanize it further. None of us are without some of this, and it's not all bad, right? But if it's the more serious level, they need 2 years of serious psychotherapy combined with other interventions, and you're probably going to have to get accountability from people, because in the early phases, Jim wasn't going to come in and say, I struggled with my narcissism again. I needed to hear from his wife how it was going, right? The same would be on a church contact. You need to get some other sources of information, because these folks are not good self-reporters of what's really going on. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think this is so sticky in the church. When you talked about appealing to the basis level and what is the crucible for change, and there being repercussions for behaviors and that kind
I think this tough line we walk is, we want to appeal to spiritual transformation, right? Oh, you can cultivate the fruit of the Spirit. And then meanwhile, things go amok on the church board or whatnot. Now, Presbyterians, we have our polity, right? Like, that's what we fall back on. This is what our polity says we do. And that's how we try to address problematic behavior. But I think in the church it's complicated. It's not like in some other workplaces where you just say, oh, you're in violation of the employee operations manual. Because it's a fuzzier, more hopeful. Anyway, am I getting out?
Yeah, I mean, I want to offer kind of a tough word about that, which is churches are the places I've seen narcissists run the most rampant in my career. Yeah. Because we want to be forgiving, and sometimes that means what Bonhoeffer would have called cheap grace. Hey, I mean, I've got 3 books on forgiveness. I'm a fan of forgiveness, but I'm also a fan of what it actually takes to change somebody. And if it's personality disorder level of narcissism, under 2 years of weekly psychotherapy with somebody who's really mature, along with some other aspects of accountability, is the bottom line. I mean, if you told me that you had somebody in your church who really had this, and they went through 6 months of counseling, I would say that that's not enough. So I just think that there needs to be kind of realism about what it takes to work out spiritual growth. And it is not going to be microwavable in this situation. But I saw Jim change. Jim, who's out on the boat, I saw him change. It took about 3 or 4 more years, but yeah.
When you're working with somebody who is narcissistic, do they actually learn empathy and compassion, or are you equipping them with tools and how to regulate their narcissism?
Varying degrees, good question. In Mike's case, it was learning tools and a little growth of empathy. He still would be below average in that capacity, but he did grow. He eventually, about year 2, was willing to work a little bit more on the trauma of his past, which helped as well. So he then eventually settled into dealing with some of his own vulnerability. He grew up, as you might imagine, in a hellacious, violent family. And then he went into the Marines, and his family table at holiday, I mean his extended family, you could get hurt at the dinner table. It was that out of control, right? So he needed, most clients can come in and they're willing to work on their vulnerability, but someone like this, he's going to need a couple of years of working on more proximal goals of skill development, and then you hope you get to a point where he opens up more and will deal with that past that's driving stuff. But I still wouldn't have nominated him to be like a therapist or a pastor or something like that. I don't think he was at that level. But his marriage was better. His wife needed a lot of work too. All right, let's keep moving. Vulnerable narcissism is the other style. These are not mutually exclusive. Don't think of these as pure types, but it's clear these are different dimensions. The big struggle for folks who have a lot of vulnerable narcissism is it's not as aggressive. It's not as much of, hey, look at me, attention seeking. Really the deep struggle is the desire, the hunger to idealize someone who's great. So this is the Robin to Batman. This is someone who is looking to be vice president or the key disciple of someone who is great. I'm not making any political statements here. I'm just talking about how this plays out. That was a joke, okay? So it's someone who wants that narcissistic greatness, but they're uncomfortable asserting themselves into that. So they have this deep hunger to idealize somebody like that. And you could call that a kind of spiritually speaking, a kind of idolatry, right? A sort of self-idolatry. I want to be that person. How do people get that? That's also developmental. All of us should have hopefully been able to idealize parents or caregivers to an extent. One of my daughters, when she was 3, she looked at me one day and she said, with a big smile on her face, "Dad, I bet you can lift a car. And I felt the anxiety, right? I felt it, because I knew that was going to go away. How do I recover when she realizes I can't do that, right? But Kohut was brilliant to see that we have a need for that kind of idealization. It's kind of a spiritual hunger. We transfer it onto the people in our lives, but there's a part of that's just good. It'd be nice to admire our parents, our siblings, people in our lives, mentors that we can look up to, right? And that can be kind of regulating or calming, right? That's my parent, that's my mentor, right? Some people have a traumatic process with that. I also had another, I don't just treat worship pastors, but this guy was a worship pastor also, who was young, and his church sent him to me because he had had an affair with someone in the church. Come to find out, I don't think they knew this. Again, explicit story here, warning. He had sex with someone from this small group in the church basement. Now, among other things, that is brazen. That is somebody who's trying to get out of ministry, which he was, right? Unconsciously, he wanted out. He was in over his head. He was about 25, great looking, super talented musician, worship leader. He had a young family. The last 2 years prior to this, when they'd gone on vacation, the church called, 2-week vacation. Church called both years and asked if they could come back early because worship just wasn't the same with them gone. He had asked 5 different men in the church if they could mentor him, which is maybe not the best idea, but he was young and he was hungry for something he needed that he knew he didn't have. Well, at some level he knew he didn't have it, right? But the church wasn't mentoring him. They were using him as what it looked like to me, right? Now that doesn't excuse that sort of gross boundary violation, right? It doesn't. It does provide a context for understanding. This was a guy who was rolling joints for his parents when he was 5 years old in their drug parties when they would come home periodically from being on the road to see him living with his grandmother growing up. That was his crazy attachment situation of his early life, right? So he ends up somehow getting a scholarship to a Christian college, super talented at music ministry and worship, succeeding, wife, 2 kids. He's empty inside. He's in over his head. At some level, he knows it, but he doesn't really have the capacity to do that. He gets himself out of it in a very painful, destructive way, right? He was a vulnerable narcissist. He wasn't someone who's going to throw a pen off your chest. He was hungry for something. He was empty inside. He couldn't regulate it. What you often get with this is very contingent or fragile self-esteem, high shame proneness, eventually some depletion and depression. A lot of goal instability in some cases. That wasn't really his thing, but like can't really decide on a direction to go. Usually a strong hiding of the self, hiding that. He wasn't revealing that a whole lot. He wasn't talking about that a whole lot, right? And often a fair amount of envy and resentment set in. He had some pretty unregulated resentment that he felt that was, again, diffuse. He couldn't put together what the whole gestalt was of this situation. He ended up losing his marriage and becoming a manager at a department store, and decided it was realistic for him to work on trying to be a better parent than he was a parent. And he didn't really want to be in ministry. That was kind of the next couple years was that, him getting himself sort of grounded and working on being a decent parent, right? That's a more realistic, for some people it's great if someone like that could make the transition to securely attached parent, spouse or partner, leader. I don't see that trifecta pulled off for folks at this level within a 2-year period very often. That's like a longer developmental process to reach all of those kinds of developmental outcomes, right? So to step back from leadership, to me, no-brainer, right? You can do a lot of damage in that. It's much better to manage a department store, right? Would have been nice if we could have had more time to work out the marriage stuff, but his wife was ready to move on, and he wasn't motivated for that, so, yeah.
I'm curious about the contingent self-esteem. One of the things that I've heard and read about narcissism is the way in which they understand their families to be a reflection of self.
Yeah,
That, children have to be perfect because if they're not perfect, then it reflects badly on them. Or
Yeah.
the wife has to be perfect, or the
Right.
husband. Is that the contingent self-esteem piece?
yeah, and let's just note that that's like a human struggle. We can all feel some of that, right? That's a normal thing that we all might like validation and prefer to have things reflect well on us. And if we kind of are more grounded in our sense of self, we don't get as vulnerable to ups and downs of that. We don't try to overpower others to like make our kids make us look good, stuff like that. But the more vulnerable sense of self that we have, the more you can see folks who can't reflect on that very much. And they do feel that everything is a reflection about them. And the folks who have the grandiose narcissism, they can have some of that too, but they often feel deep down, I'm better than you. But folks with this vulnerable form, they don't necessarily have a lot of that. So they're more susceptible to needing a lot of validation and reinforcement. If you have folks with this, in your ministries, as I'm sure all of you probably do, they're often groping for a lot of reassurance, a lot of validation, and it can start to drain people around them, probably drain you. And I heard one spouse refer to it as, my husband's a leaky bucket. You put water in, and it just leaks back out, right? So that's what feels sort of draining to keep doing that, because the self-structure is not well formed, right? So just giving a little bit of, that's why I call it cotton candy, a little bit of validation, it's not going to be nourishing because the self-structure is so fragile and vulnerable. Does that make sense? Gender stuff is interesting around this. About humility and narcissism, Jean Chichester, any of you know her work in spiritual formation? Really good stuff out of the Catholic tradition. She said, for women, a false humility concocted to maintain a narcissistic system is the counterfeit coin in place of the real thing of authentic humility. We'll talk about this humility a little bit more in a few minutes. But noting that males have more susceptibility to grandiose narcissism. With vulnerable narcissism, the research shows it's pretty even. And the larger narcissistic systems that we live in can sort of shape how this plays out. So there's Heinz Kohut. He said we have needs for mirroring and idealization early in life, and if those get met relatively well, then you'll get a kind of cohesive sense of self developing. If there's a real lack of mirroring, way too much shame. I mean, it's good with kids to, wow, look at what you did. Look at that drawing. Look at that painting. Look at how strong you are. I mean, there's a normal need for that stuff. And some kids have serious deficits in getting any of that. Often narcissists had serious deficits of that. Or the idealization. Kohut said that's a normal need. It's good if your de-idealization, your disappointment in your parents was like a fall from a 3-story building, 2-story building. It's normal to get disappointed and to de-idealize. If the fall was like a fall from a 20-story building, that's traumatic. So what was that process of de-idealization and disappointment with parents, with key figures in life? If it's a 20-story fall, you're going to have damage to the self that's going to be more vulnerable, right? You can see it sometimes in congregations. Someone comes in, They think this is the greatest church since sliced bread, right? They're passionate about the whole thing. They love the preaching and teaching. And then there's some mild disappointment that sets in. In your mind, it's not a big deal, but all of a sudden, they've had some extreme reaction, and they want to cut off, they're done, right? That's a symptom of this more limited ability to process disappointment. Put another way, though, there's a really practical point here that I like, is when working with folks around narcissism stuff, disappointment is a beautiful word and concept. So I literally use the language of disappointment a lot. For one reason, if you said to someone who's pretty narcissistic, oh, someone told me that your mom just died. I'm really sorry to hear that. That must be painful. They will say no. Or in some ways they will, because they don't want to give you that. They don't want to give you that vulnerability. They don't want to go there. But you can often get folks who have some narcissistic struggle to consent to disappointment, right? Because that's kind of a mild little foot in the door to a little crease in connection. So when I have really narcissistic clients, I will, maybe in a session, I'll use the word disappointment 5 or 6 times and they won't even notice I'm using the same word over and over again, because it sort of paces the level of vulnerability they can give you. In addition to the fact that I happen to believe disappointment is a very valuable spiritual formation area to go into. How do any of us deal with disappointments in our life? How do we deal with disappointments in our relationship? Here's a Dan Allender thing that you asked about Dan Allender. My wife and I went to a Dan Allender, he's a Christian psychologist. We went to a Dan Allender Maryland Richmond seminar our first year being married. And he said, here's an exercise you could do at home as a couple. You could ask your partner, your spouse, when have you felt the most loved by me in our time together? Oh, wow, that's a really fun question. And he said, then follow it up with, when have you felt the most disappointed by me in our marriage? And I thought, oh shit, I could not possibly, now I'm being honest with you, I thought I could not possibly ask that. I was too scared. Like, that's too vulnerable, right? But that's like hugely valuable stuff. A lot of couples therapy, a lot of family therapy, a lot of spiritual formation is around how do we respond and deal with actual disappointments. Spiritually, can we be honest with God about that? Most people who are highly narcissistic have never had an experience of being honest with God about lament or any kind of disappointment, right? And in our relationships, can we do that, right? Folks who are narcissistic, but even more broadly than that, don't have much experience with being able to do that. Because the people around them, back to your point, Joe Davis, have taken all that so personally, right? Could I ask somebody close to me, when have you felt disappointed in me, and not have to take that as totally shaming information that's only about my deficiencies, right? There's a kind of narcissism that would say, if you're disappointed in my teaching here, then that necessarily means something horrible and defective only about me. That's a kind of narcissistic stance, right? It sort of reduces your experience down to me, right? Or could I process some disappointment about people in my life and them not have to take that totally personally? And then we could have the relational conditions that we could communicate about that stuff and try to understand each other rather than blame and shame and judge each other, right? That is not part of the emotional vocabulary of narcissism. Does that make sense? Questions? Comments about that?
Okay, question then. Is so a refusal to disappointment like a hallmark of narcissism?
That's a good way of putting it. I think so. Yeah, tell me what you're thinking.
Okay, so my thought is like, someone's disappointed, like they're supposed to hang out with their friend on Friday night, and their friend doesn't show up. And then the person is like, oh, that's okay, So there's some grace, okay? The second time it happens, the next week, they make plans to go for lunch, and the friend doesn't show up again. And this time they're like, okay, it's okay, like, it's fine, but there's not an actual acknowledgement of the disappointment or
Yeah.
the sense of like,
Right.
how did it actually affect me?
Yeah,
Because
right.
it has to affect us,
Yeah,
whomever.
yeah.
And so I guess like there's a question of like, where does grace come in?
Hmm.
Like a sense of mercy and grace
Mm-hmm.
alongside of the disappointment. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
My curiosity.
yeah, I think I'm tracking with you. I think that, well, I've got a couple thoughts. I think one is sometimes in the Christian community, I think we foreclose on some of these virtuous responses before going through any kind of realistic process. Maybe you're not surprised to hear a psychologist say that. But, and I think that's sometimes actually quite inauthentic. So we could call that maybe sort of grace bypass, which is a sort of defense mechanism against the fact that I'm really pissed as hell that you stood me up, but I'm really uncomfortable feeling any of that. And what gets reinforced in my particular spiritual community is a kind of smile and, oh, it's no big deal. No, that's fine. I understand, right? And if that's virtue bypass or spiritual bypass, it's cotton candy. It has no real substance. And theologically, I don't believe God values that. I don't know if I get away with that. Anybody want to fight about that? I think read the biblical prophets lately. Man, they are rough on that kind of spiritual bullshit. They really are. So if it's grace bypass, because I can't tolerate disappointment in life, or I can't tolerate my own dysphoric feelings, because I don't trust God or anybody else to meet me in it, then I don't think that's really good formation. Now, I don't think it's great that we go around just constantly disappointed, and maybe I don't sound like a lot of fun because I'm saying I think disappointment is like a wonderful window into like good stuff, because if we actually deal with it in a spiritual and psychological way, it requires us to grapple with existential realities. We live in a fallen world. Things don't line up. I'm on this side of heaven, and this side of Eden, right? To do what we were talking about before. It doesn't seem that way when I'm at Lake Tahoe, but that's the reality. And in this landscape, I'm going to have disappointment. The question is, how am I going to deal with it? And can anybody in my life handle that? And do I believe God can handle that? Or do I think God wants me to be a smiley face? And that isn't good relational development. I don't see good fruit coming out of that.
Yeah, because otherwise you lose your sense of being human with a full range of emotions.
Right. So you put a leadership team in that space, and that's what they're doing with each other, it's not going anywhere. You put a couple in therapy, they can't process any of this stuff. Again, it's not about shame and blame, it's about, can you process your honest, subjective experience and try to have the maturity to understand that the people I'm relating to also have a different experience. You all have a different experience of what we're doing here in the moment, right, than I do. That's the reality, right? So in any moment, some of us are going to feel joy, some of us are going to feel disappointment. What's our capacity to connect in the midst of that? Oh, this is good heavy stuff. Other questions, reflections on this? And I think there's another thing, is I think some narcissists in religious communities get away with their stuff because they operate off of this sort of inauthentic, toxic positivity. We've got to always be smiley and happy, and they don't have to do that, though. They expect everybody else in the congregation. Yeah.
Totally. Okay, so a different question is, could people who, it's a continuum.
Yeah, right.
Of narcissism, could that show up in certain places compared to other spaces? Like with certain type of relationships versus, like on the pastoral leadership board, like maybe there, but not necessarily with the newcomers coming to church.
100%. So what I would say is then when you get to the more extreme of personality disorder, there often isn't the flexibility to code switch in different settings. Now, throttle back a little bit, you might have some people who do a lot of this narcissistic stuff at home or in a particular context where they feel more freedom to operate that way, but they maybe have some level of flexibilities. They don't run that everywhere. Yeah. But the freedom to shift kind of goes away over time. We got a break soon. Let me just get through a little bit more and set up the humility. This is just a fun one. I enjoy this reflection. I was years ago preparing a lecture on existentialism, and here was the dialogue with my daughter, who was 16 at the time. Hey, what kind of jobs can you get doing existentialism? She looks over the shoulder at the PowerPoint. What kind of jobs can you get doing existentialism? Me, well, like a philosopher or a psychologist. Wait, don't you have to be really smart to be a philosopher? Isn't that great? The normal narcissistic injuries of life. This is one of Kohut's other great terms, narcissistic injury, right, which he normalized. Like these things happen, and it's a little bit of a bump or sometimes a bruise to like we want to feel good about ourselves and like we're special and doing something. And this is a great, right, this is innocuous. At 16, she could have been trying to do this, but she actually wasn't, right? Because there's actually, with parenting adolescents or young adults is quite a trip, because narcissistic injuries become kind of the normal everyday stuff because of their developmental need to give critical feedback and to de-idealize and to kind of push away. One of my daughters also was fun. Around this age, I remember coming home from work, and she had walked in, and I said, hey, how'd your day go? Stop interrogating me, right? So there's kind of this developmental need that if we're really sensitive and can't get ourselves differentiated, it can all feel really wounded, and does, right? And we all have those moments. The question is, can we put it in context? Can we not take it so personally? Can we rebound? Some people don't have much of that capacity, right? It all is personal, and they have to fight in response or throw a pen. There isn't much freedom, right? Okay, so let's take a...
I'm sorry, you said, can we not take it personally? Can we rebound and can we...
Yeah, can we rebound and sort of see a broader context, right? That our adolescent child is processing their own independence and their own desire for autonomy and their own mood regulation. And so that response doesn't necessarily reflect something intrinsic about who I am as a parent or what our relationship's about. Now, in the moment, it might feel that way, but can I step back? The congregant's response, can be devastating at times, right? And what's our capacity to get some support, to get some reflection, to see it in a broader context? For me, it's student feedback, client feedback, responses to our research. My first book that came out, I was about 29. Someone sent me this totally idealizing letter about this book changed my life. And the next day, I got a letter from a guy I knew in the biblical counseling world who had written a book review saying that this was totally manipulative heresy. And the fact that those two responses were on back-to-back days was actually formatively helpful. I was like, oh, you know what? I don't think either of these are the complete truth. I don't think I get the cotton candy of idealization, but I think this really mean-spirited attack. This guy knew me and sent me the book review just to make a point. Neither of those, they're both playing something out. Something they got going, they're on a trip with that. They're playing something out, right? We need the capacity to do that. Some people have serious deficits in their ability to do that for various reasons in their history, and they need some space to be able to work on it. Not for their whole life, not 20 years of therapy, but they need a period of time with some real dialogue, accountability, honest feedback, and if that takes 2 years, man, how many hours there are in the life of an infant when their attachment templates are being formed in response to caregivers? When I see people for 2 years in therapy, weekly, that's fewer hours than, an infant's attachment templates are formed, right? So 2 hours is nothing, right? I'm amazed. It's like miraculous. When somebody can like shift their relational template in 2 or 3 years. I have students who say, it takes 2 or 3 years. I say, well, you're in like a master's program that's probably 2 years, and we're not trying to change your whole being. We're just trying to teach you some stuff. And I'm like, oh, I guess that's right, right? So there needs to be a period of time, but not their whole life, right? Okay, good work so far. We'll do humility when you come back in a little relational spirituality. Let's take about 15. Yeah.
We covered it, but does this exist in culturally or like people groups? Embody narcissism?
Seems to be that it can take different forms. I mean, it's we're the most, in the US, European forms, white forms, the most kind of haughty, grandiose, outwardly arrogant. It does look like you can go to different cultures and you can still find narcissism, though in collectivistic cultures, it's going to have a bit of a different package to it sometimes.
I was thinking, the term white fragility.
Yeah.
The inability to sort of
Right.
accept certain realities.
That's a great connection.
Is that a form of narcissism?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
I think that often maps onto vulnerable, but I've seen, so again, that's a combo platter for some person. We did a white fragility study group, one place I was doing some consulting, and there was a staff member, a therapist, who was super narcissistic, and we were studying white fragility, and she just kept exhibiting various forms of white fragility, and it was so tied to her narcissistic response, she couldn't tolerate discussing those issues without feeling tremendous reactivity, anger, shame that she couldn't regulate,
I've experienced that firsthand as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like for white people, I think facing racism is a kind of narcissistic injury that is necessary, to face that reality and look at our complicity in it and all of that. And it takes some self-development to
that
do that.
fragility is that form of injury that they're
Yeah.
experiencing.
Yeah.
Because everyone's racialized.
Yeah.
That's their level of.
And then as the book says, when they make it about themselves, then, like the whole group needs to attend to them, that's an expression of the problem of the narcissism, right? The fact that they maybe have some emotions they're struggling with wouldn't be the issue, but the fact that they can't regulate it and they're okay with sort of turning the whole group process on take care of me now.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's helpful.
Yeah, I want to mention that when we come back. That's a great point, Martin. All right, let's come back together. Bad news, we got too much good stuff to talk about. We're just going to have to work through lunch. We'll just eat snacks. Or I guess that doesn't really fit with what we've been talking about, right? I just thought inducing discipline. So we're going to do a little bit of the humility stuff and a little bit of the relational spirituality stuff. People want to vote. How many want a lot of humility?
But why, will you talk about that?
1, 2. How many want more of the relational spirituality? Yeah, okay. All right. We'll do a little bit of both, but we'll lean towards the relational spirituality. So I just thought this is a really interesting reflection question to do. So let me just also allude to, with humility, this makes for a great formation retreat, series of classes, sermon series. There's just so much you can do with humility and this narcissism stuff. We did a humility formation program at Gordon Conwell's Urban Seminary in Boston, ran a study on it, which was one of the studies I sent out today. There's just really cool stuff you can do with this to walk people through this and draw on both psychology and spirituality, biblical texts. We won't take a lot of time for this, but I love to open up this question. What does it mean that God is humble? What if we had that in our wider Christian discourse these days, or wider national discourse when God is invoked, that God is actually humble? What does that mean in terms of our doctrine of God, our understanding of God? I just think there's fascinating things. So some of what we came up with, this humility model that we worked in that study and in our research, is we found it interesting to think there's 3 counter-humility temptations that we're really prone to as leaders, but these are also more general. And so we framed up our formation retreat and stuff around this. The temptation towards expansive grandiosity, even if we're not like a full-fledged grandiose narcissist, there's pulls towards over-functioning perfectionism, narcissism in ministry, I think, in leadership. And that's one temptation. On our team, we sometimes playfully, like, wait, are we, we're starting to overfunction in work we're doing. What are we, functional atheists? We don't think God can cover this stuff. We've got to work around the clock, right? Reactivity to difference and conflict, another major theme. Problems like ethnocentrism, or like Martin and I were talking about, white fragility, shame, resentment. That's in this whole cluster of, as a leader, how do I deal with differences and with conflicts? Those are inevitable, right? Am I highly reactive? Do I have any way to metabolize that? Any way to view those issues in context? Any skills for dealing with them? Crucial area. Hiding the self, that's the third big counter-humility temptation. We have research to support this. This is not like I'm overpowering you with my grandiosity. This is, I don't really need anybody. I don't want to take up any space. I don't want you to see my vulnerability, right? That can result in different kinds of problems, but isolation, hyperautonomy, maladaptive forms of self-soothing, right? We found this a helpful kind of threefold model. What we've done in our programs is to invite leaders to reflect. You create space for the reflection. Which of these temptations are you struggling with the most? It's not one size fits all. It's, are you being pulled towards one of these right now? And then create space for what would be some kind of humility practice that you could commit to that could be sort of an antidote to this, right? Maybe I decide I really need regular accountability, connection, someplace I'm really known that counters that isolation, right? Maybe I realize I really have to grapple with my ethnocentrism, my reactivity, my view of conflict. I may need to really work at that. Maybe I need to process some forgiveness towards people that I'm really frustrated with or hurt by. Maybe I need to practice more boundaries and downshifting and finding other sources of validation other than this sort of expansiveness. Maybe it's my context that's pulling me that way, or maybe there's also something within me that's driving me towards that, right? So we found that we've got effective results from this, really seemed to work well. We gave seminary students space to work on that, followed up a month later, found that that sort of intentionality about committing to a practice seemed to make a difference. Differentiation of self predicted growth in humility over that time. So back to that point, for those of you who are differentiation fans, that seems to be relevant here. A lot of attachment security stuff in relationship to God was also a variable that made a difference. So this is a model we found useful. But what do we mean by humility? Claire Wolftyke's a theologian at Boston University I worked with on a grant related to this. Humility is hummus. It's hummus. It means from the earth. So let's start with that. Humility means from the earth, from the ground. How do I orient to my human finitude and my human limitations? Do I have incredible shame that leads me to avoid that at all costs? Or can I orient? It's like the earth. It's like good Iowa soil. Okay, that's the one I go to. All right. How do I face my limitations? You know, when I have those times where I'm behind on work and I think, you know, the next couple nights, I'm just gonna stay up a couple more hours and work. I try to remember this and sort of think, wait, I'm gonna try to cheat those couple extra hours of sleep. I think I'm gonna get by without it. what am I doing? Right? What am I doing? That may not be humility. So we define humility in a multidimensional way as a willingness to engage in accurate self-understanding. So these are all different aspects. Accurate self-understanding. Accurate self-understanding. Awareness of my strengths and my limitations. Low concern for social status plus strong solidarity with the oppressed. Now, again, you got to see this in context. I get a lot of social status from my privilege. So if there are other folks who are feeling more concern for social status out of equity, we got to view that in context, right? But in an American capitalist system, as we've talked about a lot of times, this can also become a kind of an idolatry that we're all up against to some extent, right? So where am I at with this? A receptive orientation towards others and teachability. Teachability is a great word, you know. The guy with the binder of his marriage course was low on teachability, right? We had to work that out, right? The ability to manage self-conscious emotions, pride and shame. That's that kind of narcissistic stuff. Not that I'm not going to have pride, which can be good, or shame, which may have somewhat of a place. I'm not a big shame fan. But can I metabolize that? Can I process that stuff? And do I have a genuine appreciation for the value of things outside the self? Right? So multidimensional. Authentic humility is not shame, humiliation, or self-hatred, lack of voice or empowerment, denial of strengths or talents, or excessive idealization of other people. These are all frequent trauma effects, by the way. Trauma tends to induce these, and these aren't humility. And this in itself is a useful conversation if you're teaching this stuff, to get people into dialogue about this. Now, we have some different definitions we can have. If anybody wants to go to bat for Calvin, I'll give you some time here if you want to. If anyone wants to defend Calvin. So I just think we should look at this and reflect on what we've got in the Christian tradition. For I do not call it humility if you suppose that we have anything left. We cannot think of ourselves as we ought to think without utterly despising everything that may be supposed an excellence in us. This humility is unfeigned submission of a mind overwhelmed with a weighty sense of its own misery and poverty, for such is the uniform description of it in the Word of God. Offer stands. It's the 16th century.
I think this is what I learned. I mean, like, as a child growing up, I think this is, my parents were not Calvinists, but I think that the self-degradation of self, it was a huge part of my upbringing and religious understanding.
Yeah.
That if you are a Christian, you humble yourselves before God and before others. And that means putting others always in front of you, which I think becomes a method by which we self-depreciate or self-denigrate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fair to say women are especially socialized into that sort of orientation, often people of color, right? So 16th century, we'll cut Calvin some slack. But, you know what? Oh, I know this is going to sound narcissistic. I'm going to tell you that I think Calvin, at least today, is wrong. Can I get away with that? Because empirically, this doesn't hold up. It actually doesn't. Just, I'm a psychologist, right? I'm doing a little theology. You guys give me a little space. I'm not a theologian per se. They put it in my title at BU because they wanted me affiliated with that school. But empirically, this doesn't hold up. You get good assessments of humility. You get good assessments of this level of shame, and they're negatively correlated among seminary students. I can show you this empirically. That when people feel this much self-contempt, they actually don't function in any way we consider humble. Like shame is overwhelming to our psyches. The mind overwhelmed with a weighty sense of its own misery and poverty does not get you to the kind of relational virtues we're talking about. It just doesn't empirically, right? But
When we were in,
go ahead.
in seminary and theology class, John Calvin's one of our theologians by.
Yeah, I know. I realize I've got some Presbyterians here, so.
But we had a female theology teacher, which opened like the world for me because one of the theologians defined in a lot of these older folks, like Calvin, older folks, dead. Said sin is pride, and I thought, that's not it. It's sin is shame, and I think it was so steeped in this kind of male view power privilege back then it did not like resonate within me. The pride was not my issue.
Right.
It was feeling good enough.
There's great feminist theology on this. I don't know how many of you have read that. Mary Elizabeth Moore. There's various feminist theologians who've actually tackled this issue and showed that we need a more differentiated template for the challenges to humility. It's not just grandiose narcissism. That's why you see in our model that there's more than one thing we think is a challenge. In our research, it bears that out. Excessive shame is also a challenge to humility. We need that sort of differentiation. And I'm glad we're talking about it because this is kind of the start. If you teach this in you get into this like this in your church, I can tell you, you will have this conversation. Because people will say, wait, I always thought humility was this, and you'll talk about this stuff. It's great. Yeah, Gary.
Well, this comes from being a couple of decades as a Calvin basher.
Right.
So, but however,
you're gonna offer a little bit of support.
I recently repented, and I think one thing that would be important to understand here, in fairness to Calvin, what's the reference point? Is the reference point to other people or to God? And so I think at Adam and Eve, at the crucial point of decision, in front of deciding to unplug from John 17:3, to be in a knowing relationship with Trinity. In other words, I think he's about resisting what I can do separate and apart from God, the God who is saying, plug back in, and you can be like us. And just as your fingerprints are unique, you'll be a unique version of us. I think if the reference point is to my neighbor, then that's horrific.
Yeah.
If the reference point is, but can I be my fullest self by dying in the sense that, I've got a better idea than God.
See, I'm glad we're.
Unnecessary to go.
No, I'm glad we're. See, this is what would be fun to do if we had more time because we're differentiating, right? Like you're speaking up about this, which is good. This is the very kind of process that I think is really enjoyable if you can set the table for this. And then the other fun turn is there's theological implications of all of this. Like, I know enough about theology to know, I don't think Calvin would necessarily have emphasized God as humble, but a lot of the theologians that I would resonate with would. And there you just have we're talking about diversity and differences, and can we relate? Well, that's another conversation you can have, right? Was that just Jesus saying Jesus was humble, but the Father is? Those are all like big ticket theological questions that may influence how you view this stuff. It's a great conversation to have. This is going to sound really humanistic to some people. Simone Weil, compassion directed toward oneself is true humility. I think this is a beautiful idea. But for some people, that won't do it. That won't register it. Cornel West has a great statement. Humility is the fruit of inner security and wise maturity. To be humble is to be so sure of oneself and one's mission that one can forego calling excessive attention to oneself and status. And even more pointedly, to be humble is to revel in the accomplishments or potentials of others, especially those with whom one identifies and to whom one is organically linked. I think that's pretty good. That's just a pretty good definition, don't you think? Applied to leadership. That's in his Race Matters book. That's really good. So you can see, you could play with this stuff, like with a group of people to wrestle. What do I think humility is about? What are the theological implications? What are the leadership implications? Great biblical resource. Yeah.
Earlier, when we did the little exercise of being in the RV, in my mind, I was in this ramshackle RV, and in the front of the cab was God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, absolutely having a ball. Taking turns driving, laughing, and they would, Luke, come on up here. And I was back and forth. I wanted, move up there and enjoy the joy of them and what they wanted to just put love and care onto me. And then, is it all right to be up here?
That's a great question. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's great.
I actually thought it was is it Cheek and Chong? Is that how you pronounce it?
Cheech and Chong.
I thought that was the kind of RV I was in.
Sounds fun. Who meets us as Most High? Different type of vibe.
But it's, to me, it's that tension
Mm-hmm.
that I live in. I
Yeah.
suspect we all live in.
Yeah, that's why, Joe Davis, you were really working us on, do we believe we're worthy of love, right? Are we moving through the shame? What's the barrier, right? And feeling like I got to stay in the back of the RV, what is, we could talk further. Is that humility? Is that discomfort with receiving good things and love?
How does this go back to your question around humility as Jesus is defined as humble? I'm curious.
Well, I think it'd take too long to unpack that, but I just think there's really interesting questions about my image of God, any of our images of God. And this gets into real significant, valuable differences in Christian traditions of how do we understand who God is. And some traditions, I think the more Calvinist, strongly Reformed has a lot of space in it. But I know certain Reformed theologians who would not say God is humble. They would say Jesus was maybe a manifestation of humility, but God the Father is not. God the Father is a royal, omniscient king, right? And there's other theological traditions that, certain forms of liberation theology, relational process theology, certain Wesleyan traditions that would be more comfortable with a kind of humility and even vulnerability of God. And you give up some stuff either way, right? That's the game of theology, I think we all know, is however you answer that set of questions, I think you're going to give something up and you're going to get something else. But I think reflecting on what our images, when I first really did during graduate school some depth therapy and spirituality work that took me into the implicit image of God stuff, which is a big part of the relational spirituality stuff I'm going to turn to here in a minute, I had this moment where I was not into my neocortex, the theology I learned in seminary, what I cognitively believed. I was into what my implicit image was, the kind of RV image stuff. And I saw God as the Lincoln Monument. That's what came up for me. It was shocking. It was shocking. Do you like God as the Lincoln Monument? No. It's not all bad. It wasn't really God as humble. It was God as a stoic, powerful, unmoving, stable rock. That's not all bad. There wasn't a lot of warmth, accessibility, tenderness, compassion, right? That wasn't. So it was really helpful to surface that. That's a big part of what I mean by relational spirituality is not just what do I believe, but what's in there, right? You've got to get to that deeper level of what's actually in there. Now, when I saw God as the Lincoln Monument, I won't unpack my whole family history, but I could put together some relational influences that made sense out of that, right? It made sense. There was a coherence to that, right? I think we've all got that. We all have relational influences through our life that impact what that implicit image is of God. And theology often invites us to reflect on what we believe, which is great. We also need to get to those relational, limbic brain-based influences that are often sometimes a little, pre-reflective, and see what's in there, right? And I think that through powerful relational experience over time, that can also shift. We see evidence of that. That can shift over time.
So are you talking about, like, in our settings, when we get to the relational, expansive language for God being really important, instead of the kind of traditional Eurocentric language?
What do you mean by expansive language?
I mean, biblical language for God,
Hmm.
feminine, masculine, beyond gender, creation.
Yeah.
That allows people to enter, I don't know if I say this, except personally, gendered male language for God was a wall for me to experience a relationship.
Right.
And it wasn't until other images and language is more feminine, more mother, more spirit.
Right.
And like how, in my seminary, I got a lot of pushback from folks who were like, no, it's father, it's masculine, and I thought, but you're limiting sometimes, like, it's gospel to use, like sharing the good news in other language is eye-opening and expansive, using that more expansive language.
I would,
creates a relationship.
yeah, I would affirm that and also say that I think part of what I'm getting at is I think we should put psychology and theology and spirituality in play together when we get in relational spaces to talk about this, right? So to have conversations where we can unpack that in safe context, and I can tell you why certain gender notions of God feel terrifying to me or feel like a pull to me. And I can link that up with things that have happened in my life. And I can still do good theological reflection, right? This doesn't have to be all psych of religion. But that's kind of what we do at Danielson. We do that kind of stuff. And I think that there's a lot of benefit that comes from creating that kind of space where it's fair game to say, male images of God are hard for me because of this sort of thing. And you're not, if they're really important to you and life-giving, you're not going to jump on me immediately for that. Nor am I going to jump on you and call you a horrible sexist because you like to refer to God as Father. I mean, if I open prayer at the School of Theology I teach at using God as Father, I would probably have a couple of women walk out of the room. There's some, in our context, which is quite progressive, there are some folks who are coming looking to heal from traumatic injuries around sexism, homophobia, transphobia, various things. So we need to create relational spaces where people can bring all of that in and sort out what that means for their formation. I don't think we have enough relational spaces like that. I guess that's one of my take-home messages. I think we can have relational spaces where people argue about biblical meaning or theology. We have some spaces where people can get into their subjectivity and tell their story. It's really hard to find a relational space that kind of brings these things into conversation and respects people as they sort out what it means for their journey. Does that make sense? Okay, let me do this and then we're going to pivot to relational spirituality. So this is a cool little work, so about 70 pages or something, Humility, Solidarity of the Humiliated. Any of you read this? Klaus Wengst is a biblical scholar, 1988. Wengst argues that Greek and Roman views literally use the term the humble as a social class. And the uniqueness of both the Jewish and Christian traditions were to totally transform the meaning of humility. It did not refer to a social class. It referred to more of a relational virtue. And in the Greek and Roman views, to be humble was not good, right? You're the lower social class. Aristotle didn't think humility was a virtue. Jewish and Christian traditions did believe humility was a virtue, and Wengst argues they understood humility as a more communal solidarity, including with folks who are marginalized and oppressed. So that's what humility was, a big part of that. There was also a posture before God, to the point of Calvin, you know, but there was a big social dimension to what humility meant. It meant that I'm part of a wider community and I have solidarity. I'm not into this status thing in the Greek and Roman sense of I want to be part of the privileged class. So that's a really interesting biblical tradition. We have a batch of studies on humility. It's positively related to intercultural competence. We have this fun measure of spiritual grandiosity we've used in a bunch of studies. Folks scoring high in spiritual grandiosity are not fun at a party. Like, they endorse items like, you know, I'm closer to God than everybody else, and but we get seminary students and folks endorsing that. It's not related to intercultural competence, as you can see, or humility. Same with social justice commitment. Bunch of research with seminary students, ministry leaders, seminary professors, showing that on average, various forms of humility, general humility, intellectual humility, are positively related to concerns about racism, sexism, and reducing poverty. Whole batch of studies on that. Social justice, I know that's a controversial term in strange ways these days, but this is what the research shows. Humble people in these settings tend to be committed to those.
How are you measuring humility in these settings?
We're using measures based on that definition I gave. So the way the social science, you know, we have items that kind of get at aspects of that. These are self-report studies, so people can, I mean, it's kind of amazing when you think about it. People can rate themselves the way they want to. Yeah. And then they're just telling us how much do they care about racism, sexism, or poverty, and they could say whatever they want, right? I mean, you know, they could say, oh, I really am concerned about racism and I'm super humble. But we have these impression management scales. And that's the kicker, that these impression management scales detect a tendency to overrate one's sense of virtue and social desirability. So when you use that as control, you have to see, does this stuff still correlate? And what's interesting, good or bad, I mean, depending on how you look at it, right now, commitment to these things in the Christian communities that we study is not really related to impression management. So there's so much controversy about them that people are just kind of straight up, and not everybody actually cares about them. So you get a lot of variance there. And that allows you to see, do these things really hold together or not, because there is quite a bit of variance. I mean, it wouldn't really work if everybody rated themselves high on this. But this is over and above controlling for impression management. I know that's kind of fancy social science stuff, but is that making sense? Okay. All right, here's the main model from, this was from a study, we got a couple studies supporting this, but the main one was from a study of faith leaders from the Abrahamic faith. And we found humility, the way this works, follow it left to right, was positively related to mental health and well-being, negatively related to narcissism and spiritual grandiosity. That's what you would hope. In general, in these leaders, this is over and above impression management. Humility is good for mental health and well-being in these traditions. Hold up for both genders across these traditions. And here are the mediating mechanisms. In my line of research, that's really the key thing you want to know. What are the factors that account for this? So you're really trying to find out those middle variables. Humility is affecting mental health positively, but what accounts for that? Differentiation of self, secure attachment to God. Those are the relational spirituality factors to hone in on. That's what we found in our intervention study at Gordon Conwell. Those are the factors. If you're going to put your money somewhere for the formation stuff from a relational spirituality perspective, focus on those things, because that's what will connect humility to those positive outcomes. Okay? Maybe take a question or two as I transition over to a few points about relational spirituality. Y'all holding up for the final dash here? Okay. So this model developed out of some of the early spiritual formation research we did in seminaries, and then extended to our psychotherapy work at Danielson. So it's really a model that has emerged from both working with faith leaders and also in mental health. We use it in both angles. And it goes like this. This was the early sort of Christian version book, Transforming Spirituality with theologian Laurent Schultz, and then this is our more recent psychotherapy application. So it starts with focusing on spirituality as relational. It's the ways we relate to God and the sacred. And that can include both salutary and pathological ways of relating. So it's got that broad angle to it. We suggest that relational and systemic dynamics can shape our relational spirituality, our relational experiences, wider systemic factors like racism. And change in our spirituality typically involves a destabilization involving this dwelling and seeking stuff, which I'll unpack for you. I also put in here this relational integration book where we have case studies about this kind of stuff if you want to look at that. Okay, so a couple interesting examples. This was from a case study masked in our psychotherapy book of Sophia, and it's a relational spirituality example. This is going to be intense. I'm going to read to you this quote. This came up in her therapy. She said, "I really believe God is sentencing me for something. I'm not sure for what exactly. I really wish I knew. Not even a trial, I guess just for being a disappointment or somehow not being worthy of his attention or approval. It's like he's decided to make a point out of me that no matter how hard I try, I will come up short, and therefore I deserve to be unhappy and alone. When God is against you, you are really fucked." Let's take a deep breath. I heard some groans. So this too is relational spirituality. Do you see it? What do you see? Where do you see relational spirituality in her lament? Or questions of it? Yeah.
I'm just kind of filtering it through my lived experience, and I used to believe this when I was younger because of the theology that I was taught. I thought that it's taught like the fire and brimstone in hell, and it wasn't until I had a relationship with people who had different theology that shaped me. But that also has to do with their particular relationship with God,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then also who's informing that relationship around them, who's shaping.
Mm-hmm.
What they believe, what they feel to be true,
Mm-hmm.
And how that's shaped in that kind of
Mm-hmm.
that relational context. So I see like multiple layers of relationship, right? Their own relationship with God, how they're experiencing God, but then also how other people around them are shaping the story,
Yes.
theology about God. So
That's the relational spirituality kinds of questions we would say is to wonder about that. If you read the whole case study, Sophia had a chronic illness, probably going to shorten her lifespan. She'd been in a car accident that killed a friend. She ended up in an inpatient unit. The therapists were frustrated. She wasn't motivated to go to college. They wanted to give her cognitive behavioral therapy. They didn't engage this existential level. She finally got in a therapist who was open to it, and this is the lament that came out. Other relational dynamics you see. What is she saying?
Abandonment, unhappy, alone, distant,
Yes,
no response.
yes.
And power is taken away.
And what?
Power is like taken away. Like,
Yeah.
this is just my
As a Latino, I see this every week.
Mm-hmm.
You feel stuck between heaven and earth. I think that you feel stuck because you feel the wounds and the reality of your Latino country depends on your barrio. place where you grow up.
Mhm.
You grow up with a father, with our mother, or all those reality things.
Mhm.
And you think that I deserve this, or that God is see me different than other people from around the world and the new generation. My generation didn't have all the electronics, but the young people now they can see the world.
Mhm.
And then I said that you feel stuck between heaven and earth because you have a spirituality
Mhm.
really informed with a strong God,
Mhm.
and He's gonna send you to hell if you don't do this.
Mhm.
So we grow up running from hell and the devil to God,
Mhm.
but not because I'm not running to God because He is a beautiful, loving Father that is saying, "I love you."
Mhm.
So you're stuck. I mean, this is part of my story, of course, too. So I'm part of that. So I see my story in a way.
Mhm.
But that's why I say you feel stuck. So in the process, you see yourself so unworthy. You have a theology cognitively, but you have to disengage your body and fracture yourself
Mhm.
in order to try to keep functioning
Mhm.
and living good into the eyes of the church or the denomination, but you are just dying internally.
Mhm.
This is why I see like every day. So I have found in my context that lament has been the spiritual practice actually
Yes.
to integrate
100%.
your
Yeah.
body as a human body
Mhm.
and your spirituality. But the struggle for some of the people that I work with is I don't know if I'm aware. Can I say these words to God that I hate
Mhm.
him?
Yeah, right.
Am I allowed? Because He's gonna send me to.
Right. Yeah.
But it's interesting. So you feel stuck in a way.
The first time I ever talked to God like this, I'm honest with you, I looked at the ground to see if I was still alive.
Yeah.
Right? That's how deep the prohibitions go against lament. She found in psychotherapy she could lament. Right? Great exercise. I've done this with a group of pastors, good Bible-believing pastors, put this up and ask the question, we won't take a lot of time for it. Where is the hope in this? Where is the hope in what Sophia is saying? I mean it as an honest question. She's giving voice in a courageous way, right? She's pushing back. It's agency. When you're overcoming trauma, you need agency, you need raw, honest processing. And you need to find out if the people that you're working with on it can handle this. That's a key trauma principle. I was struck early in my career that folks who had this much trauma, they would test me early on. I always thought I was assessing clients. You know this, Gary, as a psychologist, we do assessment. The clients will assess us too. Can you handle this? I had a client who brought bloody artwork to the session, the first 3 or 4 months of therapy, and she would show it to me. And she wanted to see if I could handle that before she was going to get into her stuff, right? Was she going to scare me off? Normally, you scare people off with this stuff, right? Or people pathologize it, think it's crazy, feel pity, right? But they don't see that this makes sense from her experience, right? Now, I ended up working with her in therapy. I've changed some things, but she has a graduate degree. She's probably making more money than anybody in the room. It's not all about money. But she was on the margins, right? So she did a lot of work to process this stuff, to get it a different place. That's tremendously hopeful, I think. But people need to be able to process this kind of stuff. And it's relational spirituality. Let me give you a different example. A.W. Tozer. How many of you know A.W. Tozer? Somebody who's A.W. Tozer for anybody who doesn't know? What's his contribution? Spirituality. What's he most known for? Powerful descriptions of intimacy with God. Here's what his biographer noted. His family and closest friends all testified that Tozer, who magnetically attracted spiritually alert people who longed to know God, kept almost everyone he knew at a personal distance. It was impossible to get near him or his past. What do you make of that? Huh?
Mystery.
This is from a relational spirituality question. I'm picking on both Calvin and Tozer a little bit, humor me. There's all kinds of examples of these dilemmas, and it opens a great set of questions, right? We all have our relational issues and vulnerabilities, right? This is a pretty radical disjunct from amazing ability to describe intimacy with God. They also describe in this book that they kept Tozer away from people in the congregation. Late in his career, some woman said she was in the hospital. I have to see Tozer. She wouldn't accept anybody else, probably narcissistic. And they took Tozer out of the study, over to the hospital. He was so brutal in that interaction, they sent him back to the study to write books and sermons, you know. Now look, I think we should be troubled by this. And we should all own our disjuncts, right? We should all own whatever our relational issues are in process that are influencing our spirituality, our relationships with others, with spouses, with kids. We should all own that. And they're going to be interconnected. But I think we need honest conversations so that we're not operating in the church off of spirituality bypass or these kind of thin approaches that aren't really relationally grounded. That's the point, Gary.
Just makes me think of the difference between like, in spirituality writers. Are you writing out of a deep hurt-based longing, or are you writing describing yesterday's found experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can be saying the same things.
Yes. Yeah. I haven't dug into it, but I mean, the question I would be curious about from a relational spirituality perspective is also what was the trauma in Tozer's history that put him in an Iowa metaphor here, a spiritual silo that meant he could experience some powerful things with God, I assume, but couldn't move laterally. There had to be something that put that into place that was never really addressed, right? So that's a relational spirituality perspective. Okay, so we're going to wind up here with dwelling and seeking. These are the two major dialectical themes in our model. I love to do a meditation on this that we won't take time for, but it kind of works like this. It's an interesting thing to put up with a group. Look at these two biblical passages. Which one are we supposed to do? That's the question I like to ask. Which one of these? Are we supposed to be still or are we supposed to seek? So, from the relational spirituality perspective, we say this is one of the great dialectics of spiritual development and of life, actually, is that we have a need for spiritual dwelling, which I'll define in a moment, and we have a need for the movement of spiritual seeking for growth and deeper understanding. And they are sometimes, at least temporarily, in tension. And spiritual maturity is about learning to balance, integrate, listen to which of these. Around the humility and well-being stuff, what I like to do, again, if we have more time, is discern the question, is God inviting you to be more still, to settle, to rest, to Sabbath, as you raised, Brian, to quiet down? Or is God inviting you to stretch into some kind of growth? Those are both aspects of humility in my view. Sometimes humility is, look, I need to rest more. Sometimes humility is, you know what, I'm not that good with racial issues as a white person. I need to do some work, right? Those could both be humble commitments. And I love to invite people to reflect, listen, pray. Which of those are you being led to, right? So let me explain how this goes in our model. In terms of attachment, the orientation towards dwelling maps onto the safe haven function of attachment. It's wonderful to have safe havens of safety and connection. Seeking maps onto the secure base function. These are actually map on to somewhat different outcomes. Well-being is especially enhanced by dwelling, safe haven. Seeking often leads to growth. We have 4 dimensions of spiritual seeking in our model: sense of community, spiritually and emotionally regulating practices, spiritual awareness or mindfulness, and internalized commitments. These are all aspects of what we mean by spiritual dwelling. At a more archetypal level, it kind of maps onto themes like home, if you want to get to kind of a deeper level. and a sense of orientation, grounding, right? Spiritual seeking is different. It's a willingness to explore new spiritual understanding, an openness to difference and diversity, an ability to tolerate ambiguity, reflective growth in spiritual complexity, which often comes when we've experienced tragedy or trauma or encountered a more diverse world than we understood before. We have to account for that spiritually. I like the image of going into the forest, right? There's a bit of ambiguity and tension to that. We actually assess these. We have assessment tools in our clinic, which we hope to eventually develop these for seminary students and leaders. But we have a system where we collect data through assessments, and Sarah Crabtree built this ability to turn it into reports that our therapists can use with clients and show them these to map over time how they move in spiritual dwelling, seeking, and struggles is another area I'm not going to talk about, but pretty fun to be able to look at that. So I love this quote by geographer Yi-Fu Tuan, existential geographer. Place is security, space is freedom. We are attached to the one and long for the other. That is the dialectic of dwelling and seeking. Do you want a sense of place, home? Do you want a pull towards freedom, change? Throughout life, we're having to sort of contend with these and balance these. These are just powerful forces in human life, right? So we find that over time, in general, like you can find people that score really high in spiritual dwelling or people that are strong spiritual seekers. That's an interesting conversation. We found data with both mental health clients and with emerging faith leaders that in general, on average, it's good to be able to sort of balance and integrate these over time. That there's some benefits to being able to get grounded, connected, which is dwelling, and some benefits to being open enough, flexible enough that I'm willing to learn new things, make adjustments, learn to relate to diversity, right? If I'm a rigid dweller, I mean, that's really kind of what fundamentalism is rigid dwelling. There's eventually some limits to that. If I'm a constant wandering seeker, I had this great group of rock climbers that I had in therapy, a series of friends that referred their friends. And they were like hardcore seekers. They were running on the existential edge for various trauma-related reasons. And they couldn't dwell. And eventually the whole string of them started coming to therapy because they got towards midlife and they couldn't rock climb the same way. They were realizing maybe I should develop some relationships or some sense of community, but it scared them. Dwelling scared them. They didn't want to be enclosed, right? So it's really interesting, what are the existential anxieties that drive either rigid dwelling or rigid seeking? And what's the formation question is, what is my invitation to work on at this season of my life, right? So we've got data to show that it's generally helpful to balance this. So a couple final comments about formation. In this model, I really am drawn to the idea that formation or even therapeutic change, I would apply this to both, is a lot like cooking. It's a question of how much heat do you need at any given time under somebody's chair. And so we use this crucible model that raises the question of how much anxiety is helpful for the changes that need to be made. Now, early in my career as a therapist, I cooked with heat that was too low. I was uncomfortable stirring things up with people, asking tough questions, the kind of questions Jesus asked. Jesus asked these obnoxious questions at times, didn't he? We all agree? Yeah. Do you want to get well? Remember that one? Oh my gosh. That isn't a question for information. That is a question to cut to the heart of motivation about someone's defensive structure, psychologists talking, right? So I learned to do that a few years into my career. And I was scared to do it. I thought people would get pissed and leave. and some people did, but I found it proved tremendously effective. And then I started cooking with too high of heat because I got kind of intoxicated with, I was slinging these prophetic questions around all the time, you know, and I would overcook sometimes, right? But that is the question, is how much heat or anxiety do you want to have under people about change? That's the way we think about in a relational spirituality framework. So ideally, we like the metaphor of a crucible, which has been used by various spiritual writers through time. Gary could document versions of that through church history. And some really insightful spiritual writers. One of my favorite is David Schnarch, Danielle, the differentiation guy I was talking about, who died a couple years ago. And a crucible is a resilient vessel in which metamorphic processes can occur, right? You put base metals in a crucible, heat it with fire, it transforms them. A furnace is sometimes the metaphor of a crucible. That's how I view what therapy and formation are about, is how can you create crucibles? The way you do that with people is you put them up against their deepest values and goals as they intersect with the developmental growth that's necessary. That's where the crucible cooks.
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah. You put, it's right here, and this is on the slides. You put people up against their core values and goals as it intersects with the developmental growth that's necessary. So I'll give you a provocative example. Sometimes Jesus almost seemed a little sarcastic too. I'm asking permission to tell this story. So, for example, a pastor a while back who's in couples therapy, we're getting into some intense stuff. I put him up against the fact that he's really successful in ministry, but his marriage has sucked for a really long time and his kids don't want to have a relationship with him. And we cooked around, is that okay with you? Is that okay with you? And I'm not going to decide that for him. That's his to decide. See, that it doesn't cook if I decide it for him. It's between him and God. I'm going to move the embers around. And I stoked it a little bit more. I mean, he was getting pissed. I stoked it a little bit more. I said, look. His wife said, I said, look, you've been really successful in ministry, it seems. You could just rest on that, right? That's one option. I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is up to you, but you could just rest on that. He was getting more, I stoked it, right? That seems obnoxious, but I see Jesus doing stuff like that in the Gospels. At least I'm justifying it that way. It intensified it because I knew that's what he was thinking anyway, right? I just was going to say it. We're going to have a conversation about that. And I'm also letting him know, I'm having a relationship with you, and I'm not making this decision for you. That's how you cook in the crucible, is I'm not making this decision, but I'm gonna shape this dilemma, this existential dilemma that you can't really get out of, and you're gonna have to make a decision on it. Sometimes another way of stoking it is, we get into something like this and they'll try to change the subject and I'll say, look, come on, Tricia, you know me well. I'm a dog on a bone about this stuff. I asked you a question about what you want to do, and I won't talk about anything else until you answer it. That's all I'm going to do, right? We're in a crucible when you do that stuff. And what's amazing to me is people are looking for that. Not 100%, but early in my career, I couldn't imagine you could do that sort of stuff. But people want that. They want someone who takes them seriously, who cares, but will not rescue them, and will take seriously the dilemmas they're facing, and these are adults, treat them like an adult. I mean, I have some boundaries on this. I'm not going to let people get away with violence. Usually not illegal stuff. That's a little fuzzy, you know. I mean, you gotta look at some, but for the most part, cook the existential dilemmas and force people to be adults and take responsibility for their lives and sort out what they're really doing. So the final thing I'll say, so in our Transforming Spirituality book, we have this stuff. That's the Christian version. I mean, when I was working on this model, I was struck how many biblical narratives have transformation happen in dark spaces. I mean, I had an evangelist pray over me when I was an adolescent. You will go from strength to strength. I can still remember it. You'll go from strength to strength. It's going to be an upward slope in your life. And everything's going to get better. And man, I was pissed when I got to graduate school and was depressed and was having all kinds of relational, So you need to set up, I think, from this perspective, that God can be found in dark spaces. Because I think that there's many metaphors for dark containers of crucible processes where transformation happens, right? So, final point, the tomb being the most obvious one. So, this is in Transforming Spiritual Life. So this is the figure to depict this. We'll just take a couple minutes and we'll be done so we get to lunch. So this is kind of depicts the model. So this inner circle is spiritual dwelling. So if people get into their faith, they find patterns of relating to God, they find some prayer practices, worship practices, and you're going in this inner circle. And in this model, we'd suggest that can be great for a season, and then inevitably, eventually, it's going to lead to either some sort of boredom or disappointment or discontent. Inevitably. Maybe you get a 10-year run, but you can't do the same spiritual stuff over and over again without any change and still get positive effects, right? But are you going to take this off-ramp we call the awakening cycle into this outer circle of seeking or not? Because if you venture out in this outer circle, you're now exploring the unknown, you're wrestling with some deep existential questions, right? What is my life really about? What is my marriage really about? What is my ministry about? And this is going to increase anxiety. In this model, there really is no transformation without an increase in anxiety. There just isn't. Anxiety is not all bad from an existential perspective. So now if you go out here, though, people around you, like if you look at the book of Job, they may say, come on, Chris, you're overthinking it, man. You're overthinking it. Come on, just come back to church. Here, Chris, I got a book for you. Huh? Yeah, podcast. Yeah, right? Come on, dip back into the dwelling cycle, Chris. It's always been fun, the way you are spiritually, right? Don't overthink this stuff. So a lot of temptation, and that's anxiety reducing maybe. But that isn't transformative. So if you stay on this outer seeking cycle, you're going to go through, one way of thinking about it is what the contemplatives described, or the purgative way. Things will probably focus and feel somewhat darker and more ambiguous. And you'll understand you're cooking with some questions you really can't escape. Now, this is the crucible. This is how we depict the crucible process. This is a crucible. So out here, you could break out of that and go rock climbing. Not that rock climbing is all bad, but you could go do something that's a flight from all of this, right? I'm just going to go in this wandering cycle. I'm out of here. I'm not wrestling with the spiritual questions anymore. I'm not where I was. I'm just not going to worry about it for a time. But if you stay with this seeking cycle, and you have the right relational container, from the relational spirituality perspective, what holds these crucible containers in a constructive way? It's relationships. It's people who are differentiated enough to connect with us in our crucible process, I like to put it this way, without rescuing or running away. Do you know people that will sit with you in that process, care about you, but not rescue or run away? It's hard to do that. Look, but that's what my work is as a therapist. I think it's what our work is as spiritual leaders. I need to connect with people, create these crucibles. I'm with you in this. I'm not going to rescue you. I'm not running away. I think that's how transformation often happens, is in that space. And people come to some new way of relating to God, themselves, and others that is transformation. Looks like you got a question.
I have a question. How does this compare to the stages of faith, the critical journey of getting to stage 4, hitting that wall and having to go through?
That was an influential model, actually. Yeah, the critical journey, that hitting the wall. I mean, I like the crucible metaphor more than a wall because it's a little more relational to me. And I like the dwelling and seeking themes as in a constant dialectic. And so that's what we went with, and we've got some pretty good support that empirically describes changes. So it's not the only model you can do. That stages model is really interesting and was formative for me. But I kind of enjoyed working with this one. Gary?
I just had a very similar thought. I was thinking the stages of faith, but I think in a way that is supportive of what you're saying.
Yeah.
At first, I was kind of thrown off a little bit by thinking of like St. John the Cross and the notion of what about someone whose way of seeking is abiding? But in the stage of the faith model, it's like, you know, stage 1 and 6 are the most alike, childlike faith and the mystic.
Yeah, right.
And but like 2 and 3, that you made a reference to fundamentalism, can be more of the stuckness, the dwelling,
Mm-hmm.
and then there are the challenges and the seeking, the other phases. But in the end, the childlike faith, the faith of the mystic, might be the discovery of the way to seek is by dwelling.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed out, because we would say that in the model, that you can come back to a place of dwelling that is somewhat relationally different. It could also be childlike. From our perspective, we would want to see more secure attachment and better differentiation. So I might be childlike in my faith, but mature in how I relate to people who view their faith differently, right? Which is really, the road less traveled. Ricoeur had this idea of coming back to a certain naivete about faith, but it's on the other side of really wrestling with things, and it usually isn't as rigid and reactive to other people. So we got to go to lunch. So thank you for taking all this in. Appreciate the conversation.